our scripture today comes from the book of 2 Samuel. Any 2 Samuel fans out there? Oh, sure. Somebody says, whatever you like. This is 2 Samuel chapter 6. Let me warn you before I go into this. This is a long one, but I promise you I'm going to do my best to make it worth you sitting through that. Are you willing to go on the journey with me? So this is chapter 6, 1 through 19. Okay, so just hang in there and try to, as much as you can, just sort of envision this story as I'm telling it. And as always, be listening in this for God's word to you and to this community. It starts with King David. He's bringing up the Ark of the Covenant into the city of Jerusalem. That's the context. So here's what 2 Samuel says. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him sent out and went from Baal to bring up there the ark of God, which is called by the name the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark, and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord has burst forth with an outburst upon Uzzah, so that the place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day. He said, "How can the ark of the Lord come into my care?" So David was unwilling to take the ark of the Lord into his care in the city of David, and instead David took it to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, for 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. It was told to King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed an ox and a fatling. David danced before the Lord his might. David was girded with a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of a trumpet. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed food among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes. Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I just returned from about 3.5 weeks of vacation. And before I go any further, I just want to say thank you to Lauren and to all the crew for holding down the fort in my absence. I'm very grateful. Being able to be gone that long was really a gift, and it allowed me to just be fully present with my family on the continent and sort of put out of my mind my responsibilities here in Hawaii. And I gotta say, I did that so successfully that it wasn't until I arrived back in Hawaii late Thursday night that I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to preach on Sunday? Like, it just didn't even occur to me until I got back here that this Sunday was still going to come around. Usually have a little bit more idea of it ahead of time, so I immediately went online to check what the lectionary text assigned for today was, and I instantly knew that I was going to preach on this story from 2 Samuel. Because it's one of my favorites. I feel like I say that about all these types of scriptures, but this really is, to me, it's one of the most visceral and emotional scenes from the Old Testament that can really tell us a lot about faith. And I really just want to sort of explain this story to you in detail this morning. That's my big, ambitious goal coming back here from vacation, so that you can be as excited about it as I am. Now, perhaps it was a little bit difficult to follow while I was reading. I could tell you guys were trying to stick with me. Maybe it's been a while since you all have done an intensive study of the David narrative in the Old Testament. Is that accurate? Yeah, maybe in the pandemic you guys weren't at home just reading 1st and 2nd Kings or anything, but I forgive you and I absolve you. But certainly you have seen the 1981 classic film, Raiders of the Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Any Indiana Jones fans out there, right? A young, dashing Harrison. Now you see Harrison Ford, and that you think, so you have some context for understanding that the Ark of God, the Ark of the Covenant, is essentially a box which contains the 2 tablets Moses received from God on Mount Sinai, in which were inscribed the 10 Commandments. So that part is true. I'm sad to report that somewhat the rest of the story of Indiana Jones is not totally in tune with the biblical narrative. But on one other point, the film does agree with the scriptural record, and that is that the ark is a very powerful thing, okay? So do you remember that in the movie, it like vaporizes a bunch of Nazi sympathizers? In fact, I was just reading some reviews. I was like, maybe we should show that to Oliver. And then I read this review of what parents need to know. All the Nazi sympathizers get vaporized. I was like, okay, well, another couple years until we can see Indiana Jones, right? But the idea is that the ark is powerful, and in a way unpredictable, and in its own way willful. So like I said, this is a box just containing these tablets, and don't think like cardboard box. This is a fancy box, right? Earlier biblical texts go into extensive detail about how this would be built and decorated and all sorts of materials that would go into it. And on top of it are these cherubim, right? Think like winged celestial creatures, not chubby baby, creatures, but sort of intense, maybe a little bit intimidating winged creatures, but who knows? And those winged creatures their wings form a kind of seat, because the sense was this is where God would sit on top of the ark, right? This is ancient thinking, right? But this is where God's going to sit. And if that sounds weird to you, think about this. The ark was just a concrete expression of God's presence. So where the ark went, God went too. And actually, if you read more of 1st and 2nd Samuel, you hear the ark has this kind of exciting history. Like at several points, it gets stolen by rival tribes, and then it causes all these problems. Maybe you remember that from Sunday school. The rival tribes are like, fine, take it back. We don't want it anymore. It's just causing problems. But again, the point is it has power. And so in this moment in the story of David, its movement is also about the movement of power. So I'll just give you a summary, since none of you owned up to reading 1st and 2nd Samuel recently. The entire story there is sort of about the transition that Israel is making from a federation of tribes to united monarchy, right? A bunch of sort of ragtag groups in the desert that are loosely connected to a single nation. And 1st and 2nd Samuel are a lot about the power struggles that unfold as various leaders kind of jockey for control of this emerging consolidated body that will be Israel. And it's speaking of things that are not appropriate for young children. Basically most of the Bible, Old Testament at least, but it's really violent and bloody, and there's betrayal and misdirection. And even though David is God's chosen one through much of this story, he spends most of it just running for his life from his enemies and hiding. He spends most of the time scared and alone. And though he eventually ends up the victor and is crowned the king of Israel, it is not without some significant personal loss, right? His beloved friend Jonathan and his mentor Saul are both killed in this whole exchange. And so in this scene in which the newly crowned David is bringing up the ark and thus bringing the presence into the new capital city of Jerusalem, there's a lot of emotion. A lot of stuff has led up to this moment, right? The people have been on a long journey. And it's interesting that though this could have been a private affair, just David and some of his priests could have gone and brought this thing to Jerusalem, David invites everyone to join in. 30,000 strong, and the parade and dancing and instruments. I mean, did you hear it while I was reading? And the cymbals and the tambourines and the harps. And it's joyful, right? But it also, if you sort of know the history, seems to represent some sort of catharsis, right? We're celebrating the presence of God that's coming, but also it seems like a kind of cleansing joy, a joy that's trying to help the people move past all that's come before. But then on the way, this really strange thing happens. Uzzah, who is driving the cart, which is bearing the ark to Jerusalem, notices that the oxen have shifted. Seems like he's worried the ark might fall off the cart, which when God is sitting on something, you probably don't want to have that fall on the ground, right? And he reaches out to steady the ark and touches it. And in the interpretation of the author here is struck dead as a result of touching the ark, right? Now, I want to say that the lectionary, so the schedule of readings that we have that sort of gets us on track with the Methodists and Lutherans and other people that chose this story for today, it leaves this whole part out about Uzzah. It just goes right from David was dancing around, it was so great, and they were going to Jerusalem, and then David was dancing around again, it was so great, and going to Jerusalem. Yeah, so, and I can sort of identify with this. You know, I think if Kalua were here, she would be laughing because she always teases me that she says, which verses of the hymn shall we sing? And I'm like, okay, all the ones except that one about Satan and that one about death and that one about evil. But let's leave in the love and joy and celebration, eternal life part. But this seems like in this story, this is such an important part of what's going on because he dies and it's in the middle of this joyful celebration and David gets really angry. Right, David's confused and he's sort of in this kind of anguish, right? Like here he is trying to do this good thing and yet tragedy is still following him. And I think more than all that, he's kind of scared because he has staked a lot on God's presence with him in the days to come. And yet this is sort of further proof that God is unpredictable. And he asks himself, right, how can I bring God into my house? It's almost as if he's saying, have I put my faith in the wrong thing? And so maybe you notice as I was reading, David decides not to bring the ark up to Jerusalem, right? He sends it somewhere else to another place, the house of Obed-Edom, and he leaves it there for a while. It's like he pushes away the bad and scary thing, right? He pushes it away. But here's the strange part, right? Obed-Edom is blessed by the presence of the ark. And David starts to get these reports about how things are going, and eventually he comes around. And this time he goes about things a little bit differently. He seems to dispense with some of the pomp, right? He says, okay, no more cymbals, no more tambourines, no more lyres, no more harps, right? Today we're just going to have singing and the trumpet to speed the way. And he and his men make sacrifice, and then they dance, and they bring the ark up to Jerusalem as they had planned. There's several really interesting things to note about this part of the journey, and the first is that, you know, I just love imagining David dancing with all his might, right? And this bit, there's a little thing in here which is hard to catch, but the implication here in the text is that what he's doing is dancing with all his might while he's naked. Yeah, okay. So did you know there were like nudity in the Bible? You didn't even know that, but there is, right? Yeah, so, okay. The theme of the day is 4-year-olds, we're glad there are none of them in here right now. So David is dancing with all his might up to Jerusalem, and he's naked. And, I used to take this as a sort of science to see this. He's just so happy about bringing up the ark that he has no inhibitions at all. You know, but reading it this time, it really struck me that another possibility is that having lost so much and risked so much, that David really is literally and metaphorically coming before God with everything stripped away. No more pretenses, no more hiding, right? His whole self is before the Lord because there is no longer any other way. And I actually think that's rather beautiful. Now, unfortunately, not everyone's in agreement with that. David's wife, Michal, looks out the window and sees her husband dancing naked up the road, and she is pissed. And I actually once knew someone named Michael Bet after this woman, and I said, oh, who's that? She said, well, it's a woman in the Bible that gets really angry that David is dancing naked. And I thought, I would love to know how your parents came to the idea of naming you after this, right? But I think this is just another example of how very few things in this story about David, about this one person and his people trying to travel with God, very few things in this story are pure. Instead, as William Blake would write a few thousand years later, joy and woe are woven fine. Here too, happiness and anger, faith and uncertainty. So they bring the ark up to Jerusalem, right? And now you are thinking, what a cool story, right? Death, intrigue, Indiana Jones, nudity. This is awesome. What does this all mean? And happily, we've run out of time now for the end of the sermon, and I'll just let you go make meaning while I continue to recuperate from jet lag. Just kidding. I think this story speaks to a lot of things. So I'll just mention a few that come to me as I see this story, and you can also draw your own conclusions as always. But the main thing is that this story seems to me to be about the mystery of God, about how the presence of the sacred is less predictable and less manageable than we tend to admit. It's about how the holy is powerful. Sometimes I think in the progressive wing of the church, we want to underemphasize that. The good news we want is that we can understand and categorize and contain and kind of manage the holy, right? We love that. That's not always how it works. Mercer University professor David Garber calls this story proof of God's dangerous otherness. And I think that's just about right, God's dangerous otherness. Why did Uzzah die? It's not really clear. And though I don't subscribe to the same system of understanding that the author of 2 Samuel did, which attributes Uzzah's death to God's wrath, I do know that there are often times when we are trying to do right and things go wrong. We're trying to live well and tragedy strikes. It's a mystery, and if we're really honest, it's a painful one. And like David, our impulse is often to push it away and to put it somewhere else, to withdraw into ourselves. But another thing I learned from this story is that ultimately, when we draw the dangerous otherness of God close to ourselves, when we draw it into our hearts and into our homes, when we stand exposed before the one who made us and can unmake us and remake us, that is really where transformation begins. And sometimes we get there through opportunity, and sometimes we get there through tragedy. Sometimes we arrive at that place and we realize there really is no other way. But I do really believe that's where the Spirit starts to be at work within and around us. So I just want to share this before I close. Many of you know that I was visiting family in Oregon during this last month, particularly my mom, who I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years. I know a lot of you sort of shared that experience of being separated from people. And it's the truth that she is in the last chapter of her life. My mom was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease 35 years ago, and she was 42 years old. And in all that time since then, her body has never been a particularly hospitable place to live. But especially now, as we had always anticipated would be the case, it's failing her. This is not something that I talk about too much, simply because it's not wholly my story to share, right? It's hers as well. And I've always wanted to respect her privacy and also sort of the sanctity of that shared history. But we've had a lot of ups and downs over the years, and as you can imagine, in a way, this sort of chapter of my mom's life is a lot of our fears being realized. But one thing that I have learned from my mom, and anyone who knows her would know that this is the case, walking with her all this way, I have learned how to keep dancing. Even when it's difficult, and even when it's painful, even when it doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think what we've discovered as a family together is that for us, pushing away the realities of this human life, which often includes sickness and include loss and death, that's not the way to find blessing. Neither is dwelling too long on the enigma of them. For us, finding a way to press on is the key, even if it isn't quite pure or isn't quite as perfect as we imagined. And I'm so grateful for this time that I was able to have with her in these last weeks, time that you all gifted with me. And I was able to have some wonderful conversations with her while I was there. And actually, some of the best ones were actually about her death. As of now, she is still with us, but we both know that won't be the case for long. And we talked about how sad we were that we don't have more time, and how glad we were for the time that we did have. We talked about how hard it is that she won't get to see my kids grow up. And we talked about all the wonderful ways that we would help them to know her and to remember with us the wonderful stories of our family. I have to say, in those conversations, I felt like so much of me had been stripped away. It really felt like a place of vulnerability, as I imagined David might have experienced. It felt like we were bringing the dangerous otherness of God right into the small space between us. And you know what? It felt like peace. It felt strangely like blessing. It felt like bringing God into our house. And I tell you that because I want you to know where I am on my journey and what I've been doing, but also in case it's helpful to you, because this is really where my faith is these days. Understanding that the journey with God is varied and often impure, unpredictable, and surprising, but that embracing it instead of pushing it away is the way that we find connection, the way that our fellowship is enriched, and the way that our hearts and our lives are grown and blessed and transformed. So I offer those stories to you that they might be a blessing to you and to your journey, and I thank you for the time that I spent that allowed me to forget all about what we were doing this morning until just recently. And I just ask that God might be present and in these words, the God who created us, who redeemed us, and who sustains us always in this life and in the next.